don't know exactly. I believe I was named after uncles that my parents favoured. You don't need all those names in America. Which name do you want to get rid of? I don't care. Just strike one out. He eliminated Max, now a popular name. The citizenship ceremony, with speeches from prominent politicians, moved me. With a prayer and a certificate, I had become a citizen of the most wonderful country on earth. Little did I know that I would attend similar ceremonies in the future for my adopted immigrant children, or that I would cause thousands more to take place for other children who were born abroad, adopted, and brought to America. During my first years in America, German immigrants colonized neighborhoods in Minneapolis. Not all of them acculturated. Some could only find fault with American customs and culture and did nothing but complain. Many of the newer arrivals never tried to learn English. Worse yet, they made no attempt to obtain U.S. citizenship. Somehow they found jobs with other German speakers and lived for weekends when they could try to create the Gemütlichkeit that they formerly had in Europe. For some, their dream was to go back to Germany to show off their newfound wealth. Small house parties evolved, and the groups eventually joined with full-fledged clubs established by Germans who had immigrated before World War I. The members could not relate to what we, who had immigrated after World War II, had been through. Yet here everyone could get back to their roots. Most just wanted to talk and to sing and dance to German melodies. The German club had also organised men's choirs and women's gymnastic groups. Among the new members who arrived after World War II were survivors of the Holocaust. Native-born German speakers, they also had a need to be in touch with the culture in which they had grown up. They spoke German and Yiddish, which has Germanic roots. The survivors were tattooed, a sight that sent a chill up my spine. Nazis had tattooed numbers on the forearms of every person forced into concentration camps. When the Jews had disappeared from Kiel, I was a child living under a dictatorship that planned to exterminate the Jewish population. I knew nothing about Judaism. In POW camp, I made up for lost time and informed myself at the library with books on Jewish history and beliefs. Once I settled in America, I finally had the chance to go to the library to learn more about Jewish philosophical and religious movements and the differences between Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform synagogues. According to news I heard in America, the West German government tried to help those who lived through the Holocaust. Release from the concentration camps left the survivors homeless and penniless. When the German government had money in its coffers again, it made reparation payments to Israel to send to the survivors. At the German club, where I thought I was one of the youngest, I saw a short guy with brown hair and brown eyes who looked about 25. I took him aside. I wondered how he ever got into the German army. Turns out his story was far more unusual and tragic than that. Manny Goldman was an adolescent when the U.S. Army liberated the camps. His entire family had lost their lives, and he had no place to go. As a Jewish child, he had been denied an education. Smart as he was, Manny could barely read or write. When word got around that Manny was living on the street by the railroad station, several German families took responsibility for him until he was old enough to manage on his own. He married a German girl and immigrated. By the time I met him, he and his wife had opened a successful sandwich shop with his reparation money. His circle of devoted customers grew because, regardless of what had happened, he was basically a friendly, optimistic guy. All of them knew the story behind his tattooed numbers. When the subject of concentration camps came up, his pretty blonde wife told me, "His memories are extremely confused. It was just too terrible. Manny lost his parents, his brothers and sisters, and the rest of his relatives one by one. He felt so lonely. He doesn't mind talking about it, but he's not too sure what was real and what was a nightmare anymore." Some Jews chose to remain in Germany. Regardless of what had happened, there seemed to be a need in every Christian and Jew to return, at least for a visit, to the motherland. Somehow I was able to save money for a trip to see my relatives soon after immigration, probably because I hadn't adjusted to spending as much of my income as Americans did on living expenses. Of course, Germany had changed very little since my departure. The trip reinforced my conviction that the United States was a land of limitless opportunities, regardless of my difficulties in getting settled here. My American dream went kaput when my wife walked out on me. When we married, she continued to live as if she was still single. She kept her personal life separate from mine and went out with her friends in Kiel. After immigration, I thought that she would finally adjust to marriage, but as soon as she heard about the German parties, she got excited. She took off on a continual round of them, whereas I preferred to stay home with our son. Although she had shown little interest in learning English before immigration, she quickly learned to speak the language and to drive a car, and she found a job in a bank. She created a new social circle of German friends that soon widened to include Americans. The chasm between us kept widening until, after 12 years of marriage, she fell in love with an American. When our union was legally dissolved in county court, I made history as the first father granted custody in Anoka County, Minnesota. Even though my ex was granted visiting rights, she only asked to see our son once in the following 6 years. He was shattered by her desertion. Depressing. Yet I couldn't give in to it. I called her my ex-wife. My son called her my ex-mother. He seemed to need more comforting than I could give him. Should I return to Germany so that my son would have loving relatives surrounding him? They would help me raise him to adulthood. I wrestled with the issue for months. I talked to friends, neighbours, the school, and my minister. Most of them approached my problem with pragmatism. They believed that our return would be one more difficult adjustment for him, since he would have to deal with the same school system as I had. He would have to make a lot of adjustments. He was a good student here and well liked by his teachers, who told me he was college material. If he had the desire and the finances, he could earn a college degree. In Germany, they would give him a test to determine his educational capabilities from then on: vocational school, technical school, or college. My fate, a technical school, had been determined with a test when I was a hyperactive 10-year-old. For me, the move would mean that I would have to give up everything I had worked for in order to face an uncertain future career-wise in Germany. The job I had with the British was long gone. If I returned to Germany, I could say goodbye house, goodbye car, goodbye continuing education. I decided to stay. I was determined to obtain an American college degree. I took the first steps toward my goal when I enrolled in an accounting course. In the meantime, my son and I adjusted to our new situation. We still had good friends, nice neighbours, a house in the suburbs, and our church. Eventually, I met an American woman, Jean, who was in similar circumstances with her 9-year-old son, Arthur. She was 28 at the time, and I thought she was pretty. Her job in publications paid as well as mine. She managed to accomplish a lot at once, including cooking gourmet meals. I was smitten. My German accent and my foreign ways did not put her off. One of her grandfathers was a first-generation German immigrant. Her grandfather and grandmother on the other side of the family were first-generation immigrants from Sweden. Even her father had spoken with a Swedish accent. Both sets of grandparents were farmers who had homesteaded in Minnesota. Jean was born and had spent the first 10 years of her life in the tiny Norwegian-American village of Sacred Heart, Minnesota, where she had become accustomed to hearing another language and participating in another culture. Even though we were born on opposite sides of the Atlantic, we had a lot in common: heritage, values, Lutheranism, and even a cuisine. Both of us coped with the responsibility of home ownership, a full-time job, continuing our education, and most importantly, raising a son to be a responsible adult. As their sole means of physical, emotional, and financial support, we took our duties seriously. Jean's son Arthur was 3/4 German, a tall, blonde, blue-eyed boy like my son Jörg. An intelligent, resourceful boy. I hoped that he would take a liking to me. In the letters I wrote to my parents each week, I began writing about Jean. My family urged caution. When I told them I had asked her to marry me, my mother and sister were shocked. They had only seen American women in the movies and on TV. Did she wear makeup, high heels, and smoke cigarettes? At that time, she did it all. Did she know anything about housekeeping and cooking? American women were glamorous creatures who never did anything useful in the movies back then. Jean's mother wasn't thrilled with me either. Even though she was half German herself, she was prejudiced against me. The subject of the Nazis and the maltreatment of Jews always seemed to come up, yet if I tried to explain my age at the time of the war, or the suffering my family had endured as a result of it, she ignored me. Despite our relatives' skepticism, we were married in 1961, joining 2 households and 2 only children. I went back to county court again to adopt Jean's son. Our major task was to try to get them to adjust to each other. We bought model airplanes for them to build, which they worked on together and equally enjoyed. We took them on picnics and to art and history museums. Sundays were special days that we always spent together. Our new family learned everything any of us ever wanted to know about being a stepchild or a step-parent. Our sons had a lot to contend with in those days, when divorce was still a rarity. The boys watched the news with me. We were all feeling proud of our well-educated, polished President, John F. Kennedy. At that time, the papers were full of stories of dangerous escapes by East Berliners into West Berlin. They tied themselves under cars, tunneled through buildings, and flew across the wall in gliders. Some of them tried to just make a run for it and were shot in full view of their relatives on the other side. During that time, Kennedy travelled to Germany to show America's support of West Berlin. He made his famous speech with a line that no one who heard it ever forgot: "Ich bin ein Berliner." Yet he was partly responsible for our war in Vietnam. American teachers were sending our sons home with conflicting ideas. Arthur said, "I'm going to join up as soon as I'm old enough, because we have to win." On another day he would come home and express other ideas, which I shared. War is futile. Arthur struggled with the ideology of the hawks and the doves. By the time both boys graduated, they had been exposed to all of the counterculture ideas of that era and had no desire to take part in the Vietnam War. This was a difficult time for parents who tried to enforce rules that no longer seemed valid. Many teenagers felt that the rug had been pulled out from under them. They tried to make up their own rules as they went along. Even though our sons and their peers were tantalized by different ways of thinking, believing, and behaving, their innate sense of morality eventually brought them through to responsible adulthood. We managed to visit Germany twice before our sons graduated high school. The first time was a year after we married. A few weeks before we left, a fellow employee accidentally knocked me off a ladder. I fell 12 feet to the cement below, fortunately not head first, but this was when I broke my femur, the large weight-bearing bone in the thigh. Since we had saved and planned for over a year to take this 6-week charter flight with our sons, I decided that we should go to Germany anyway. I learned to walk on crutches and used wheelchairs when I could. Knowing the trip from Frankfurt to Kiel by train would be difficult, my parents met us at the airport and helped us to the train station. Our boys were 10 and 14 and full of curiosity. Dazed after our long flight across the ocean, Jean snapped out of it when she met my 67-year-old father, who told her to call him Detlef. While my 69-year-old mother, Ellie, exuded a calm peacefulness and had grown grey-haired and a bit stout, my father was a 5-foot-5-inch bundle of muscle, and he looked 10 years younger. He wore the distinctive Keeler cap over his still dark brown hair and ordered everyone around as if he were still a policeman. He settled us into 2 Mercedes taxis with vases of roses on their dashboards to take us to the train station. Mother was shy with Jean, who was dressed in the latest fashion, a raw silk suit topped off with a beehive hairdo. Father got in the taxi with my wife and held her hand all the way to the train station, as if to say to her and my mother, "Don't be afraid, I've got everything under control." Once aboard the train, my parents told me about all their preparations for our stay. They were still in the same apartment on the harbour, restored to its former self and now freshly wallpapered for our visit. When we arrived, I noticed that each room had vases of flowers and boxes of chocolates and other treats sent by friends, neighbours and relatives. Mother had given herself to others all of her life, and now they were reciprocating and making us feel like celebrities. Jean was impressed. She told them so in her best German. She had studied for a year in order to speak conversationally. but shortly after we arrived, she said, "I can't understand them." She looked crestfallen. After I listened for a while, I realized that they were speaking Low German. "When did you start speaking Low German at home?" I asked. "Well," my mother said, "our son-in-law Helmut feels more comfortable speaking Low German, so we gradually started using it too." They had to make an effort to remember to speak in High German, so Jean understood operettas sung in High German that she watched on television better than she could understand my relatives. She tried to fit in, but it wasn't easy. She was surprised and delighted when my parents gave us their bedroom for the duration. She had never seen such a huge bed. It was piled high with red satin goose-down comforters over layers of other goose-down comforters, with goose-down pillows wedged high under trapezoid pillows. The huge bed was actually two beds pushed next to each other, each with its own separate bedding. While I gratefully eased myself into a reclining position, Jean scrabbled around, trying to get comfortable. "Do all Germans sleep sitting up?" she asked. "I never thought about it, but I guess they do," I said as I nodded off. We slept so soundly that Mother came into the room to wake us and grew alarmed. Since Jean couldn't find the light switch in the dark, she had given up trying to throw out all the pillows and wedges and had curled up at the opposite end of her bed. "The head cannot point towards the window," Mother muttered. "It brings bad luck to the house." I had forgotten all about her superstitions. The next day we settled into our pattern for the next 6 weeks. Our sons shared a room which had been sublet to a student who was temporarily housed elsewhere. Mother and father slept on fold-out couches in the combination living-dining room. They were light sleepers and the first to rise, tidy up, and make coffee. Over a breakfast of eggs, bread, jams, and cheese, my mother would open a discussion on a daily activity plan. She would take everyone into consideration and help them come to an agreement. During our stay, the daily plan included sightseeing and obtaining extra items on Mother's shopping list. Jean compared this to the helter-skelter way her own family dealt with each day and said, "Now I see how you learned to keep everything running so smoothly." With little room for storage and 4 more people to feed, grocery shopping was done on our way back from day trips. Specialty shops abounded: coffee, tea, fish, meat, vegetables, and pastry. We ate like kings. An example of this vastly improved quality of life was at Elke Stammer's wedding. Elke was the baby my mother had helped deliver during an air raid. Elke's parents still lived upstairs. By pure chance, she had planned her wedding to take place while I was there. My parents and I could not help but marvel that we were together again, and that their lives had improved more than we could have dreamed possible. In that very apartment, 2 decades before, Mother starved, Uncle Hani died, and my parents struggled with worrisome thoughts while my sister and I were soldiers and captives. Everyone in the building was proud of Elke, the red-headed baby born during the Blitz. She had grown into a beautiful, intelligent young woman and was trilingual: German, English, and Icelandic. Her husband-to-be, an Icelander, shyly participated in all the weekend rituals to help her make certain they had the best possible start as a married pair. The most exciting ritual to our sons was the Polterabend, a noisy night for which all the guests had been saving up their old crockery. Even though they said they didn't believe in ghosts, they waited until it was dark. Then they tossed cracked wine bottles, jars, bowls, and even an old toilet under the bride's window with resounding crashes and lit firecrackers, just to make certain that the poltergeist, the hobgoblin, was frightened away. When the bride-to-be invited the revellers upstairs to her parents' apartment, her groom-to-be nervously waited as one of the hosts for the sumptuous smorgasbord. Garnished trays of every kind of French and German cheese, as well as thinly sliced meats and smoked Keeler sprat fish, and eel from the delicatessen accompanied loaves of white, pumpernickel, and rye bread, as well as European-style hard-crusted rolls. Aperitifs, schnapps, as well as wine and a special concoction of champagne and pineapple brightened everyone's spirits. The special non-alcoholic beverage made from Johannisbeer, a delicious small berry, was served to children. The wunderbar atmosphere got everyone into the mood to form a conga line, which led up and down the apartment stairs, snaked into my parents' apartment, and curled around the table at which I was sitting with my crutches. Since I couldn't go upstairs on crutches very well, the party came to me. The following day, after the bride and groom swept up the crockery, they donned new suits for a civil ceremony. The day after that, they were decked out in traditional bridal gown and tuxedo for a wedding in the nearby church, which had been repaired after withstanding numerous bombings. After each ceremony we feasted. By the fourth day, a fabulous lunch with traditional foods was even served for the friends and neighbours who had not been able to attend the other parties. No one had to dream about the wonderful German cuisine anymore. Mother could finally cook and dine on the fabulous dishes that she had eaten before the war. While my family's life was certainly not as full of the luxuries we had in America, they were living well. Jean and I bought my parents their first refrigerator. While Mother liked it because she would no longer have to go shopping for food every day, Father didn't like the new refrigerator at all. "The butter is too darn hard and the beer is too darn cold," he complained. Papa blurted out whatever was on his mind, regardless of the consequences, and had passed this quirk on to me. One of us was usually in trouble with my mother or Jean. She soon noticed the rest of my father's quirks. He read, watched TV, and smoked all at the same time. He smothered me with solicitousness and made all my decisions for me. Jean and I couldn't go anywhere without him as a protector. He was champing at the bit. In his mind, they had retired him too early. He would always be a policeman. He said that half of Germany's citizens were either crazy or drunk, and it was his job to keep that half from bothering the other half. On one hand, he was fair and generous. On the other hand, his hot temper and impatience sometimes got in the way. He was determined to share what he had and to show us a good time, even if it meant shouting down the bossy women streetcar conductors who complained that he was taking too long to board as he loaded me, my wheelchair, and kids onto the car. He was strong and quick, and no one could have done it faster. It was usually our boys, unused to public transportation, who slowed things down. Father also put us on passenger ferries across the Baltic and took us by boat to Denmark. On every sea excursion, he enjoyed frightening Jean by pretending to roll me off the docks into the water. Father often got on Jean's nerves. Her biggest gripe turned out to be his use of her purse. She was probably no different than most women when it came to purses. Hers was an extension of herself, filled with cosmetics, feminine products, and a bit of money. No one ever dared look in her purse until my father came into her life. Every time we travelled on a passenger ferry or bought tickets for some kind of entertainment, he gave her all the tickets to hold while he pushed my wheelchair. Yet when he needed the tickets, she could never come up with them fast enough. Soon he would be up to the elbow in her purse while she gritted her teeth, trying not to scream. He and my sons pushed me along the sidewalks downtown and to the parks. On the first of these excursions, our youngest son came running out of the men's room saying, "Mum, there's a woman in the restroom." She was appalled to see older women working in public toilets. Rag in hand, they ushered people into the stalls for 10 pfennigs and handed out soap and towels for another 10 pfennigs. "This is an unsanitary way to make a living, and it should be outlawed," she exclaimed. Father grinned. He couldn't resist. "We're proud of it. What other country do you know of that can make money out of this?" On our next trip, 3 years later, the elderly Toilette Frauen were still on the job, and on our third trip, driving nearly the length of Germany, from Frankfurt to Holland, she began to notice how they put their individual stamp on the restrooms over which they presided. Doilies, fresh flower arrangements, pictures, a comfortable chair, and usually their old, battered, balloon-tired bicycles parked inside, made Jean believe that these old women were definitely a dying breed, and that someone should record them in a photojournalistic essay. We made our last trip to see my family 3 years later, as my mother was succumbing to cancer. Just Jean and I travelled to Germany that time. The boys stayed with friends. Frieda Stamer was the first to see us when we entered the apartment building. "Your mother is happy that you came so far to see her. Best of all, she is in remission." We were so amazed at finding Mother feeling well that we rented a van to accommodate 3 couples, which included my sister and brother-in-law. I wanted to retrace her life and some of mine with her. Riding in a car or van was an unusual experience for my family. None of them, including my policeman father, knew how to drive a motorized vehicle. When we came to a traffic light, they would shout, "Red, yellow, green." They never tired of the game. When we arrived at each destination, they always remarked, "So quick!" Accustomed to travelling on public conveyances with many stops along the way, they were always amazed at how quickly we arrived. Before I even came to a full stop, my safety-conscious wife would have to close her eyes and clench her teeth to keep from shrieking, "Sit down!" while my senior citizen father threw open the door of the van and jumped out. She always expected him to trip and sprain an ankle, but his sense of balance never let him down. This was our chance to see picturesque areas unscathed by war. We drove north via Flensburg to Krusau, the Danish town just north of the present German-Danish border where my mother was born. Erica even helped Mother find her old playground. "This is where you played, Mummy?" Yes, that's the place. Are the swings still there? I was the baby of the family, and my brothers and sisters took me there every day that it didn't rain. We went across Jutland north of the border with Germany to Tonda. This had been my first garrison in Denmark as a recruit. We headed south to Husum, the locale of the book The Grey City by the Grey Sea. It was here that we drove on the Wattenir of sea ground while the tide headed out. Unwittingly, we chose a day with extremely strong tides. Suddenly, we had to hightail it back as the tide turned and rushed in, frightening us with its power. As water splashed up to the floorboards, I used my Minnesota technique for driving in slippery weather and got out of there. We drove south through centuries-old Hansel and Gretel-type villages until we arrived at one known for its many nests of storks. White storks migrate between there and the Holy Land and nest there because of the numerous swamps. Storks build their huge nests over the chimneys of thatch-roofed cottages. Human tenants are not allowed to light their fireplaces during the summer nesting period. Mother scanned the roofs for birds. "Look, a pair with hatchlings!" As we stopped to take photos of the storks with tall, gangly chicks to feed, we watched one of the adults walk to the edge of the roof and take off with slow, audible flaps. Within minutes, the stork was flying back, a huge frog with legs a-dangle clamped in its beak. Now we knew the origin of the German fable of where babies come from. On another outing, we drove the same road through the Holstein Swiss hills and lakes, which I had covered by bicycle when I went AWOL. When Jean grasped the distance, she was as amazed as my parents had been many years before. Now my parents could laugh about it. In fact, they laughed until they cried. The road led to Lübeck, my chaotic point of departure to Africa and my lackluster discharge. The enchanted city I adored as a child was completely restored. How I wished that the hearts and souls of humans who survived the war could be similarly restored to their original condition. On the other hand, our scars never let us forget how easily a war is started and how badly it ends. From Lübeck, we headed south to the Lüneburger Heide, an area that resembles the heather-covered areas of Scotland that I grew to admire. We hired a horse and carriage and marvelled at the mauve, lavender and purple colours of heather glowing under a bright blue sky as far as the eye could see. Locals had heather for sale, woven into delicate basketry. Jean took a picture of my parents in the soft mauve light while they were still in the carriage. That photo, showing the humour, compassion and dignity in their faces, has inspired me ever since. They had survived the war and found meaning in their lives by appreciating the essence of their friends and relatives. They shared what they had and emotionally supported those around them. As I looked at them with the wisdom of a 40-year-old, I thought that my parents might have forced themselves to survive in order to help those they loved. Like me, teenage soldier, captive, lonely immigrant, and single parent. How would I have made it without their letters and prayers? One night, as we were sitting in the living room, my father started talking about their 50th wedding anniversary, which they had celebrated the year before. Jean said to me with a laugh, "Wow, 50 years! I've learned a lot from your mother. She's perfected a technique to cope with impulsive guys like you and your dad." With a smile, Jean asked my mother what her 50 years of marriage had been like. Mother shocked both of us. She jumped out of her chair, took off her shoe, and pretended to beat my father about the head and shoulders with it. I expected my father to get mad, but instead he smiled, whispered in her ear, turned to put on a record, then swept around again and gallantly asked her to dance. They performed a country courtship dance, which ended with my mother sitting on my father's knee. They executed it so perfectly that they had to admit that they had practiced it a lot for their anniversary party. My mother's happiness showed me how pleased she was that I could be with her while she was still feeling well, although this went unspoken. She seldom mentioned her surgery and chemotherapy. My father forbade us to talk about it. I felt uneasy, knowing that this would probably be the last time I would see her. She didn't know the cause of her cancer, but she asked me to quit smoking. I quit cold turkey, and so did Jean. Mother died less than a year later. Shortly after her death, my father also died of cancer. Then, 2 years later, my brother-in-law passed away, and my sister died shortly after him. In retrospect, I saw that had I taken Jörg to Germany at the time I was divorced, we would have ended up alone again. The family who had written faithfully every week was gone. All but 25-year-old Helga, who had lost all of her closest relatives in a few short years. Death was an all-too-frequent visitor in American families during the Vietnam era as well. The war showed no signs of winding down. President Lyndon Baines Johnson could not escape the chants emanating from crowds surrounding the White House, crowds that grew larger and louder by the day. "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many boys will you kill today?" In the midst of this, our sons grew up in the era that altered American society forever. Hippies, free love, drugs, demonstrations against war, and marches for civil liberty were their heritage. Only God knew what our boys would do. They graduated from high school, moved out as a first step toward independence, and faced the fact that they were draft age. The boys ran hot and cold about signing up before they were called up. Neither was sent to Vietnam. But I went there 25 years later, on a mission to save lives, not destroy them. A doctor's masked face looms over me. Metal clinks. He must be searching for the right instrument. The smell of antiseptic invades my nostrils, and a soggy sheet clings to my back. I must be in surgery at the hospital in Oran. Wait, my injuries aren't severe enough to warrant surgery. Stop! How dare they do this against my will? I try to call out, but I'm paralyzed. With a stupendous force of will, I force myself awake. A nightmare. Just another nightmare from the war. Shapes assembled themselves into beds and chairs and a night table with a lamp. I flicked it on and tried to make sense of what had happened. The vapours of anaesthetic were real. I knew where I was, Belize City, and the date was either June 17th or 18, 1976. I could hear radio music and my wife chatting in the next room, unaware of my drama. Something wasn't right. The keys to the van and my wallet. Missing. I rushed to the balcony and peered over the side. Odd. The van was still parked below. "Maybe I can catch 'em before they drive off," I shouted. Still groggy, I stumbled downstairs and ran to the car. Unbelievably, it was still there with the key in the door. "I guess they don't know how to drive a stick shift," I bellowed. Inside the van, everything was gone, including my precious tools and the spare. I was pumped up and ready to take back my property if I could find the thieves. But they weren't taking any more chances. I had heard the sound of my tyre rolling away, but I couldn't pinpoint where the robbers were in the maze of little houses across the street. Their haste with the tyre set off waves of staccato barking by guard dogs under the tiny, stilted houses. I ran upstairs and yelled, "We've been robbed!" Our new maid, Beverly, was teaching Jean how to braid cornrows on a model who was her old friend. "Welcome to Belize, Mon," Beverly said. "You're lucky they no thief your clothes." Her young friend nodded her head of shiny twists and coils in agreement. "The kids!" Jean yelled as she rushed to the children's rooms. I ran after her. "They're okay?" we both whispered as we looked through their doorways. Given the layout of the apartment, I was certain the robbers hadn't been in there. The audacity of those guys. The fact that they boldly entered our bedroom and sprayed me with anesthetic while I was asleep made me furious. I slammed out the door and stamped down the halls of the YWCA building where we lived. Then I thumped downstairs. A new school would open down there in August. As the administrator, I took responsibility for the building because the YWCA didn't even have a janitor. The building had been empty for 2 years, sorely neglected and repeatedly vandalized. All of the light bulbs and much of the hardware and plumbing were missing. As I checked for unlocked doors and windows, I thought that workmen could have left one open. They hadn't. My anger boiled over. We had come to Belize to help the poor, but at this rate we would soon be as poor as they. This was the most daring of the robberies our group had experienced in our first 2 weeks. 3 other adults and 2 more children had accompanied us in a convoy of Volkswagen vans from Austin, Texas to Belize. None of us had a clue that we would be discriminated against or robbed. When we crossed into Belize, the Creole customs officer pointed at our brown-complexioned twins and said, "I like their colour," indicating his attitude toward whites. His statement disappointed me. Shouldn't he have said, "Welcome to Belize, mon?" We were on a mission to help his people. The majority of Belizeans were Creoles, Harry Belafonte types of African and English heritage. The rest were mainly Hispanics from Guatemala and East Indians, whose forefathers were indentured servants. Mayan Indians, the original inhabitants, as well as British whites and Chinese merchants, comprised the minority. All of these ethnicities, religions, and cultures would enrich our lives as we got to know people. But as soon as we unpacked, we discovered that we were disliked by a lot of Creoles. In their minds, all white people were British, and they despised them. Belize wanted independence from Great Britain after years of colonization. As I was a former German citizen, as well as a former enemy of the British, this new label was ironic. For the first time in our lives, Jean and I felt the sting of racial prejudice. We were the last to be waited on in Creole-owned businesses, and sometimes they wouldn't serve us at all. We did as much business as we could with the friendly Chinese, who waited on everybody. "I wish they would get to know me before they decide to hate me," Jean had said, and stopped herself. That's exactly what a minority of colour would say in the United States. Prejudice toward us is temporary. When we leave, we won't feel it anymore. For people of colour in the United States, though, it will never go away. Even though prejudice against whites was common, we had made the acquaintance of Creoles in the neighbourhood. We knew that not everyone hated whites. Our colour didn't attract the robbers as much as my naivete. I should have taken more precautions. I was still mad enough to take on a gorilla. Adrenaline coursed through my body. The thieves must have shinned up the posts of our balcony. I had second thoughts about this assignment. My little children came first, and now that our space had been invaded, I worried about their safety. In a surge of protectiveness, I went to take another look at my sweetly sleeping children. Kirk was stretched out on his back, getting the full benefit of the breeze from the window. His blonde hair curled around his face in damp wisps. His skin was so white it was almost translucent. Our son had inherited the looks of our German and Swedish ancestors. He was 3 years old and already spoke phrases in the Creole dialect. I checked on my twin daughters. 2-year-old Tatiana and Rosanna were sleeping in identical positions, curled on their sides at the moment, their long black hair flowing across their pillows. My rage swelled up again at the thought of this intrusion. I would protect my family at all costs. When day dawned, I was going to find a safer place to live and report the robbery. The police wouldn't knock themselves out for a foreigner, but I was going to complain as a matter of form. After all, I was the son of a policeman. I had no illusions about the recovery of our possessions. This wasn't the first time my identification was stolen. In Africa, British soldiers had appropriated it. I walked out to the balcony, still too nervous to go back to sleep. Thousands of frogs and crickets filled the air with creaks and squeaks, while giant land crabs scraped and scuttled around the concrete building. Their sounds mingled with the splash of little waves that lapped up on the beach. Reflections of the moon were mirrored in the blackness of the quiet Caribbean Sea. My thoughts were still on the welfare of my children. I reminisced on how our lives had changed after Kirk came along. He had been such an unusually alert, happy, easygoing baby. We enjoyed his babyhood, and we believed that he would appreciate a sibling later on. Zero population growth was promoted at that time. We had already had our limit of 2 children. Rather than produce another child, we decided to adopt instead. Every week there seemed to be an adoption story in the news about children orphaned by the war in Korea. But when we called local adoption agencies, we were turned down. We were too old and already had too many children to qualify for an Asian orphan. When Jean talked about our rejection with a former colleague from Colombia, South America, she learned where we could adopt instead. Colombia had been torn apart by a 14-year civil war fought by 2 opposing political parties. In the 50s, political leaders, families, and even whole villages had been massacred during this period termed La Violencia, the violence. Homes and jobs were destroyed. The resultant poverty led to serious consequences. Desperate mothers who feared for their babies' survival tried to give them to passers-by or abandoned them in hospitals and public places. A generation of orphans lived on the streets. 20 years after the violence, the orphan problem had not abated. 3-year-olds carried babies on their shoulders and begged on the streets and sidewalks. Hundreds of orphanages were filled to capacity. I leaned against the balcony railing. My mind was still in Bogotá, where I had found an all-consuming purpose for my life. I had suffered through a lot of violence and deprivation myself, but I had never seen an endless cycle of poverty that forced thousands of mothers with no hope in sight to live on the streets and to abandon their children. Our Colombian friend discovered that an international adoption agency in her hometown had a set of newborn twins who needed parents. As soon as we could manage it, we travelled to Colombia to adopt them. At the house of mother and child, the founder and director placed Tatiana and Rosana, our tiny 2-month-old twins, in our arms for the first time. Dressed in long white christening gowns, the infants smiled and cooed. Their black hair, brown almond-shaped eyes, and tan skin captivated my wife and me. "Do you like them?" the director asked. "We love them," we said at the same time. What a question! We had never seen a picture of them, but they were exactly as Jean and I had imagined. We hoped that the adoption would be finalized as soon as possible. During our wait for the final decree, we stayed with the aunt of Jean's former colleague. An upper-class Orthodox European Jewish family, their grandparents had immigrated to Colombia to escape persecution prior to World War II. I'm sure that they realized that I had been a German soldier because of my age, but my past never came up. They were gracious hosts who included us in their daily activities, meals, and religious observances. The hostess, who was a social worker by profession, talked about her efforts to settle Russian Jews in Colombia. She told us that babies like ours faced a dismal future if they were never adopted. As we drove around Bogotá on our adoption appointments, we saw endless, heartbreaking scenes of children living on the streets. Our month in Bogotá made a lasting impression. The faces of all the hapless, homeless children engraved themselves in my mind. When the adoption decree was finally granted, we bundled up our 3 infants and boarded a plane home with a sigh of relief. The twins were ours. At the last moment, the director's daughter pressed photos of 8 children who needed families into my hands and changed my life forever. "Will you show these to your adoption agency in Minnesota to see if they have parents interested in Colombian orphans?" she asked. At first, I wanted to blurt, "Not now." I didn't know if I would have time to work with Children's Home Society of Minnesota, the adoption agency that conducted our social study. I would need to spend time with them to explain what they needed to know about the process in order to coordinate this type of adoption. I might have to look for a job first. My employer was probably unhappy with me, since I had taken a leave of absence, not knowing when I'd be back. I already had a night job. The twins still needed to be fed every 3 hours. Kirk was at a different developmental level at the age of 11 months, and also needed a lot of attention. I gladly gave my wife the break she needed for at least 6 hours at night. Nevertheless, my hand seemed to reach for the orphan's pictures of its own accord. In a flash of intuition, I came to the conclusion that God had a purpose for me, and it was my destiny and obligation to carry it out. "We'll find good homes for them, Senora, I'm sure we will," I heard myself saying as I put the photos in my briefcase. The photos catapulted me toward a higher purpose. The twins' adoption paved the way for thousands of Colombian orphans to find homes in the United States. In less than 6 months, the adoption agency found parents for all 8 children, and as a volunteer, I coached the prospective parents through the international steps. Word about Colombia's orphans spread, and I soon was asked to volunteer for several more agencies and to write an article on Colombian adoptions for News of Ours, Organization for a United Response, an adoptive parents newsletter. The article opened the portals to Colombia for waiting parents. Even though Jean had 3 babies to care for, she joined the adoption support group, later called Adoptive Families of America, AFA, and volunteered to help out from home. AFA was founded by adoptive parents of children orphaned after the Korean War. Later on, they took up the cause of children orphaned by the war in Vietnam. On one memorable occasion, the group hosted a seminar presented by a nurse, Rosemary Taylor. Her stories, photos, and slides of the Vietnamese orphanages shocked the audience. Because of my own experience with war and bombings, I was against this war in far-off Southeast Asia. On top of it, I had 2 sons old enough to be drafted. My most fervent wish was that the war would end before my boys were called up. Miss Taylor's humanitarian service impressed me. I wasn't quite sure how, but someday I wanted to make a meaningful contribution in Vietnam. In the meantime, demonstrations against the war grew larger and louder. As I hooked my hands over the railing of the balcony, I remembered other opponents of war, the Society of Friends or Quakers. I respected them because of their passive demonstrations and spirituality. Conversations with the Friends made me realize how much I had neglected my spiritual side. Prompts from within led me to take time out to study religion. Christian thought and philosophy had already revealed enormous gaps in my knowledge. Not only that, ever since I had visited the mosque in Tunisia and met Jewish people after I immigrated, I felt a tremendous urge to understand the tenets of Judaism and Islam. All 3 religions originated in Palestine. What was so different and so important that believers of one faith were willing to kill believers of another creed in the name of the same God? I applied for and received a grant to study at the Earlham School Religion, a Quaker seminary in Richmond, Indiana. From my vantage point, I could see the blackness of the Caribbean Sea lighten to navy blue. I remembered how we had bundled up our 3 toddlers and moved to Richmond. During my year there, I tried to understand where the Spirit might lead me. I knew that I was too blunt, impatient, and outspoken to be a minister or director of religion. My contribution would be international outreach, plans, budgets, organization, and administration. Somewhere, I believed, I would find a way to use my skills to benefit others. At Earlham, comparative religious studies whetted my interest. Memories of men in Oran and Tunisia, who dropped their work to answer the call to worship 5 times a day, was a powerful reminder of how differently we worship, yet how important God is in our daily lives. Moreover, the forbidding memories of films I had seen at Fort Knox on the atrocities committed by my countrymen against Jews were embedded in my mind. After a year of studies in the Torah, the Quran, and the Bible, I was sure of one thing. Humankind must know and understand one another if we are ever going to stop fighting each other. Real people emerge, their colour just as worthy, their religious beliefs just as valued, and their rights just as important. Such are the theories that I still hold today. But only a saint could practice them in Belize, and I wasn't a saint. From my perch on the balcony, I could see the first rays of the sun touching houses along the beachfront. I thought about my last months at Earlham. I was asked if we would be willing to serve for a year in Belize, formerly British Honduras, with the Christian Social Council in Belize City, while their director, Miss Matty, stayed on at Earlham to complete her degree in ministry. Miss Matty hadn't been back to Belize for 2 years. Otherwise, she would have known that this place was unfit for human habitation. Off in the distance, the sea and sky faded to a pale blue. Behind the balcony door, Beverly clattered about in the kitchen and snapped me out of my reveries. She would need water, and I always carried it upstairs for her. Belizeans got up at 6 or earlier in order to get their work done before the worst of the heat blazed through the windows. She was only 18, but a good cook, neat and orderly. We had no idea how to treat a maid, so we treated her like a daughter. She had no idea how to relate to us either, so she treated us like the parents she never had. She had grown up with her grandmother in a 2-room shack hammered together with unpainted boards, as did all the Belizean poor. As I watched the sun's rays touch the balcony, I wondered why I had fallen under Miss Mattie's spell. My religious studies must have mellowed me. Now my skepticism was back. Mattie had mentioned a drought, but not how it might affect us. The rainy season was late, and the rainwater collectors on the roofs and the storage tanks were empty. This meant that we had to take pails down a flight of stairs to the outside water faucet and wait for the city to turn on the water. Daily living was much more difficult than we could ever have anticipated. I left the balcony and took 2 pails down so that I could bring up water for the household. As I watched rusty-looking water slowly fill the first pail, I thought about all of my reasons for being there. English-speaking Belize seemed like the perfect place to begin a lifetime of humanitarian missions. I expected a relaxed lifestyle overseas, where I could spend a lot of time with our children while I taught survival skills to the poor and helped find American families for homeless children. After my term of employment was up, Belize would be our stepping stone to other Latin American countries. I wasn't ready to quit. After breakfast, I looked for a secure house to rent. Within hours, I found a nice big duplex in a better part of town that had hot and cold running water. We moved in the next day and relaxed. Now we could get on with our work for the Christian Council. No one would bother us here. The property was fenced in, and the landlord was rumoured to have a permit for a gun. Our salary didn't cover the rent, but I paid for it myself with the expectation that the mission board would advance money to cover it. Fortunately, they did. Baptist, Episcopalian and Methodist churches in the United States enthusiastically supported the Christian Council's projects. Each denomination had built a church in Belize City. On Sundays, we took the children to visit different churches. At the end of the service, ushers collected the hymn books. When I asked a member of the Christian Council seated next to me why they picked up the hymnals, she said, "If they don't, the parishioners leave the songbooks." Why, when the books are here anyway? It make a person feel good to carry the songbook into the church, you know, like, "This is me hymn book." I tried to imagine how I would feel or behave if I had to live like the poor did. The elderly were robbed repeatedly until they had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. Pitiful octogenarians stayed with relatives and slept on the floor. When even their blankets were stolen, they came to the Christian Council for another one. They had to get on a waiting list. How could the standard of living ever improve, I wondered. Undeveloped countries like this had little to offer in the way of jobs. Most of the men lounged about, chronically unemployed. The women kept their men and children housed and fed. Creole women supported children fathered by a series of common-law husbands. Aunts and grandmothers were the repository of biographical information. At every social gathering, they swapped information and identified the paternity of each and every child. Some children were virtually homeless. Their mothers left on job searches and didn't return for years. The children slept wherever relatives could make room on the floor. The situation was so wretched that I talked to the local welfare authorities about children I knew, and I visited the orphanages. They were full, they said. They didn't want any more children. I was told that if a mother with no means of support tried to leave her newborn in the hospital for safekeeping, they hunted her down and gave the baby back to her or the closest relative. That put the baby in jeopardy. Since the poor couldn't afford to buy manufactured formula, babies were fed water spiked with sweetened condensed milk. If they managed to survive, they got a free elementary school education. Tuition was required beyond primary school. The school we had been assigned to was the British equivalent of a vocational school. A young carpenter who had helped drive the van to Belize completed the repairs on the classrooms in the YWCA just in time for opening day. The plumbing still didn't work, and the red dust that blew in from the drought settled faster than it could be cleaned up. But the school opened anyway, and 40 students who ranged in age from 13 to 15 assembled for an orientation. They were freshly scrubbed, smoothly coiffed, and togged out in white polyester uniforms and knee socks. The Creole superintendent made it clear that she had the same rules and expectations for the students at this school as the public school that the girls had dropped out of. "This is your last chance," she said, as she glared at her huddled students. She ended with the admonition, "Your uniform must be kept spotless." Jean gave me a nudge. "Why on earth did they choose white for the uniforms? How can they possibly keep them clean in a place like this?" I shrugged. The poor of Belize, who carried their water home from a community faucet, one pail at a time, were the most immaculately groomed people we had ever seen. To me, a more pressing problem was that the school, like others in Belize, did not have books for all of the courses. Those subjects were taught by rote, which left no time for creative ideas or discussion. The girls were polite and never said a word unless asked. Even then it was hard to get a word out of them. I had pictured the school as a warm and friendly place that would help young people get back on their feet, but the Creole teachers were cold and strict with our impoverished students. I tried to get them to consider the girls' living conditions before they made such excessive demands on them, but my entreaties were rebuffed. Like the British colonists, the Creoles had a set of class distinctions to uphold. Educated Creoles did not mix with the lower class. Money for material and salaries for native teachers came from the Quaker Women's Organization and the Council of Churches. Our small salary also came from these sources. Jean taught crafts and sewing, and I was the administrator. In addition to administrative work, I also provided training for jobs in sales and bookkeeping. I wrote my own texts. In a few short years, the girls would most likely join the ranks of unwed mothers, so I also taught them how to shop. Prices were high because everything was imported via ships, mostly from British Commonwealth countries, and brought to the docks on barges. When I talked about shopping, the girls finally raised their hands. At last, a subject hit home. They had questions because the poor bought everything in small amounts. Their mothers were paid by the day and lived a day-to-day existence. Shopkeepers took boxes and packages apart and sold the contents piece by piece. This satisfied the immediate needs of the buyers, but they usually paid too much for the article. To illustrate, I brought my purchases to school and asked the girls to bring theirs in order to compare prices. We compared what they paid for one ponytail binder to the whole package I bought for my daughters. "Mon, you know how to save money?" "Mr. Erickson, how much you pay for cologne?" asked Jackie, my most talkative student. She had me stumped and she knew it. This was the female's one luxury, and it seemed like everyone in school smelled fantastic on account of all the cologne imported from Great Britain. Other than walking around in a cloud of sweet-smelling fragrances, their lives were pretty grim. Whole families lived on the money their mothers brought home as maids and laundresses. Playing store in my class was a game they liked. They brought to class little quarter-pound cellophane bags of their staples, oatmeal, rice and beans, and we compared what they paid per ounce for their little bag and what I paid for £10. To hear them get mad about how they were overcharged was music to my ears. Shopping in quantity was born at the Y, and I'm sure the shopkeepers hate me still. "When you buy so much at once, be sure you put it in a glass or a tin so Charlie Price don't get it," Jackie reminded the class. It took me 2 weeks after I first arrived in Belize to figure out who Charlie Price was, a humorous euphemism to refer to thousands of rats bigger than cats that plagued the city. Unbelievably, when I tried to buy enough rat poison to eliminate them from the YWCA, I found that the poison was rationed. I had to get tough with the Government Department of Health and Welfare in order to get twice my allotment, since the amount I needed wasn't for a house, it was for a big building. The amount I finally got out of them still wasn't enough to kill off even half of the rats. Charlie Prices were always in a twitch for scraps that everyone, including Beverly, tossed out the windows when I turned my back. "If you feed 'em outside, they won't come inside," she claimed. Beverly was ordinarily a smart girl. She had finished school and needed a job, as her grandmother had supported her since she was a little girl and taught her to be an accomplished homemaker. Beverly was also kind and patient with children. Ours attended an international nursery school during the half-day that we taught. Beverly was also a good cook, but she usually wanted to make the Belizean staple every day: coconut rice, black beans, and an occasional fish. In a quest for more variety, Jean found that some middle-class Belizeans had home freezers from which they sold homemade ice cream and beef. A Guatemalan family at the end of our block had a wizened Indian maid, too feeble to do more than answer the door. When Jean asked about the maid, the pretty Spanish lady of the house answered, "My father bought her in an Indian village when she was 10 years old. He gave her to me when I got married. Now she's so old she's not good for much, but we have to keep her. She has nowhere to go." Jean came home in a state of shock. "I didn't know what to say. I've never met a slave or a slave owner before. Is it legal here?" She always made certain that Beverly only worked 8 hours a day or less and that she had every weekend off. She knew her job, and we never ordered her about. She was treated like family, and she ate at the table with us. We were a team. The work involved in a house with no labor-saving devices was too much for one person. It took all 3 of us to keep everything running smoothly. When Beverly found a job as a clerk in a retail store, we were happy for her. We searched for a new helper and found Amelia, a young Guatemalan who'd immigrated to Belize with her mother. Amelia was related to an Episcopalian priest who visited her at our house and invited us to stay at his mission one weekend. We took this as divine guidance. Here was an opportunity to see if we could find better working conditions elsewhere. My drive through Peyton in Guatemala to Lake Isabel started just as the rains came and the rivers were high. Markers showed shallow places where buses and trucks drove through, but they left wakes like ships. Our van was too low. We were told to cross the river over a hanging bridge. I had reservations when I noticed that the crossings drew male spectators from the nearby village. But maybe they didn't have television. A macho young guy strutted up and offered to drive our bus across for a small fee. "What if he just keeps going?" John whispered. "That's a risk I'm willing to take," I said, as I looked at his smiling face and handed him the keys. Applause went up when he reached the other side. We followed on foot. He slid open the doors for us and jumped out and took a bow for his moments of bravado. As we travelled deeper into Petén, Guatemalan troops, mostly Mayans, were everywhere. One of them stood in the middle of the road and made it clear that he wanted a ride by holding his submachine gun crosswise over his head. Jean slid the door open for him. In no time, Amelia was chatting happily and feeding him tidbits out of our picnic basket. At a crossroad miles away, we let him off, and he joined a contingent of soldiers. Amelia told us that he had bragged, "We're taking back our territory, your country of Belize." Further down the road lay a beautiful mission in the jungle surrounded by Quechua Maya villages. The place we visited was an Episcopalian mission called Life, for Lake Isabel farming and educational mission. We spent a wonderful few days, feeling welcome and accepted as we toured the botanical projects, visited the priests, and even attended a village birthday party for the priest's 2-year-old daughter with about 100 Guatemalans and Mayans. Best of all, we didn't feel any prejudice. All too soon, we had to go back. When we came to the hanging bridge, not a soul was in sight. I told Jean to bring the children, our passports, and money after I crossed. The boards flapped as I drove as slowly as possible, stopping, watching, and listening for a collapse. The bridge was obviously much stronger than it looked. In retrospect, maybe I should have floored it. As we pulled up to the Guatemalan-Belizean checkpoint, we saw large troop concentrations. While we stood around waiting for customs to clear us, Amelia caught the soldiers' attention, and they ambled over to talk to her. Later she told us some of the soldiers showed off and bragged, "We're coming to your country to kill all those black people and get our territory back from the British." Belize City was in a whirlwind of activity when we returned. Air transports had delivered troops from Great Britain. Harrier aircraft were now stationed at the airport to beef up the tiny British garrison, and anti-aircraft guns were set up on the waterfront. The following weekend, we took the kids to the beach. Belizeans lounged about with their picnics and looked unconcerned as we stared unbelievingly at British soldiers who hauled anti-aircraft guns to the beach and camouflaged them with netting. Behind their backs, the Belizeans hooted and called the British cheese faces. Jean leaned over to me and said, "Honey, these heavily armed soldiers and guns make me nervous." Déjà vu, I thought, and to her I said, "You're not kidding. This looks serious." From a strategic standpoint, I could see that Belize City was easy pickings. Swamps surrounded a city built mostly of wood on 3 sides. When I heard the first air raid siren go off the following week, I went to visit the American consul. He agreed that there was no protection or any shelter provided against bombing raids by the Guatemalan Air Force. "Don't worry, I'll send a messenger if things start going bad." When I got home after my conversation with the consul, I told Jean how insecure he made me feel. I can just picture an old guy like our postman, riding his broken-down bicycle like he's Paul Revere, shouting, "The Guatemalans are coming! The Guatemalans are coming!" It was up to me to decide when to leave and how. In the meantime, at least the Vietnam War had finally ended. The Miami Herald announced the takeover of South Vietnam by the North, with reunification as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. I slapped the paper down on the table. What was I doing here? I had opposed war only to find my family in another country in a situation that could lead to hostilities. On our Christmas leave, we took the children to Florida for medical checkups. Once a specimen judged fit for tropical service in Africa, I was having dizzy spells. The children didn't have any symptoms, but they, too, were diagnosed with intestinal parasites. We had already decided not to return Belize. Jean and I tried to put the experience in perspective. What did we learn? The only thing we could come up with that might be of benefit later was that we were more aware of the problems of the poor. We had seen firsthand why mothers relinquish or abandon their children. Never to be forgotten was the fact that we had taken too much for granted and put ourselves in a precarious position. We should have insisted on more information from other sources, particularly from Americans who had lived there. Of course, no one could have predicted that Guatemala would choose that moment in history to reclaim Belize. Later on, I read in the Minneapolis Tribune that Guatemala backed off and the British contingent withdrew. Several years later, Belize achieved independence. Belize, as well as Colombia, reinforced what I already knew, that America is the most wonderful country in the world. Jean and I had time to discuss our future as we travelled back to Richmond, Indiana, to resign from our contract. Our belongings were shipped by shrimp boat to Miami. From Richmond we returned to Minneapolis. The first job I was offered was an accountant's position for the divisional headquarters of the Salvation Army, and I took it. Several months later, I returned to Miami to clear our bus and belongings through customs. After my long drive home, Jean and I tried to clarify our future goals. If we couldn't work on humanitarian aid and adoption overseas, we would find ways to help from home. Jean told me about a master's degree program she had heard about that might give us a leg up in humanitarian service. One night after the kids were in bed, she hauled out a big folder of information from St. Mary's College in Winona, Minnesota. "We can attend their week-long orientation this summer on your vacation." "And what are you and I supposed to study?" "Human development. I've already checked this out with the head of the department. Instead of working on counseling techniques like the rest of the students, we can research and write a thesis on adoption in Latin America." "How long is this going to take?" "I'm pretty sure that we can graduate in 2 or 3 years." "How much is this going to cost?" Jean held the fee schedule behind her back. "A lot. I've talked to the school about this too. We can get a college loan and have it paid back by the time the kids graduate from high school. Then we can reapply for the kids with our excellent credit," she said with a laugh. By the next morning, I made up my mind to do it. The kids heard us talk about it as they ate their Cap'n Crunch. Kirk's eyes danced with excitement. He asked, "Are you going to school too, Daddy?" Tatiana started to giggle. "Will you and Mum take the school bus?" "No, silly," said Rosanna, whom they called the smart one. "They know how to drive. They'll take the car." They were too young and playful to notice our new economies. We cut up our credit cards and shopped at rummage sales instead of department stores for the next 3 years. We earned some required credits at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota, before we enrolled at St. Mary's. Jean managed her schoolwork during the day when the kids were at school, and I dove in after I came home from my job. Sometimes, around midnight, I would pour my third cup of coffee and ask myself if the money and effort I expended would be worth it. The answer always came back to my haggard head as an unequivocal yes. The project hummed along as planned. Together, we graduated from St. Mary's College in 1980, quickly turned in our gowns, and rushed back to Minneapolis to pick up the kids and celebrate with them at a pizza place that featured an entertainer on a pipe organ who played all the songs they knew. Rosanna told us earnestly, "Someday I'm going to graduate, and I'll give everybody lots of pizza and songs too." Rosie was the first to graduate from college and was just as playful. She wore a toy diamond tiara afterwards. Her nickname is Chibcha Indian Princess. After many attempts, Jean found a publisher for our thesis, and the book, titled Gamins, How to Adopt from Latin America, became the first version of the How to Adopt internationally books that have been in print ever since. Social workers, lawyers, and adoptive parents have written us to say that the books were their Bibles when they were trying to locate an orphan or to coordinate an adoption. After we graduated, we were granted a child-placing license in June of 1981 as a non-profit corporation, Los Niños, Children's International Aid and Adoption Agency. We did not expect to make any money, nor did we anticipate much activity. Jean was most interested in the aid of orphans in third world countries, and to research, write and speak on international adoption. In the meantime, I got back in the workforce as an international accountant and later as cost manager with St. Mary's Hospital in Minneapolis. A job offer with the comptroller at Seton Hospital brought us to Austin, Texas in 1982. Jean applied for a Texas child-placing license, which was granted in the same year. Later she earned social work certification. Prospective adoptive parents in Texas started calling her as soon as the telephone was hooked up. While she gathered a clientele and took care of our home and children, I put in long hours on my new job and helped her on weekends. One night when I came home after another 12-hour day, she sat up in bed and told me some startling news. "You can quit your day job. Why don't you resign and help me? I've got more work than I can handle." "Can we afford it?" "Yes, I bank all the fees. Even after we pay the foreign adoption expenses, there's enough for your salary, starting now." She had never paid herself, hadn't even had time to think about it, and the funds accumulated. 2 weeks later, I was self-employed. For the first time, I helped our 3 children get ready for school. "Don't you go to work anymore, Daddy?" Kirk wanted to know. "Yes, I'm going to work, but I'm going to work at home." "That's good. Can I go to school at home too?" I don't think so. Your mum and I don't know how to teach elementary school. Your teacher knows more about it than we do." I was itching to put my knowledge of non-profits to work in order to build up Los Niños. It grew as fast as a kudzu vine, with tendrils that spread through Texas, branched over every state, sprayed across Latin America, and eventually reached over oceans to Asia and to Eastern Europe. Within a few weeks, I rented an office, hired a secretary, renamed the agency Los Niños International Adoption Center, and arranged the first of many adoption seminars throughout the state. Later, I would add 9 more professional and clerical staff to provide full adoption services. I was a long way from my destructive safari in North Africa. This was my first step in a safari to save children. It was like an epiphany. 8 orphan-saving expeditions, 1982. Tatiana and Rosanna stare in rapt attention at babies bundled in the same little cribs they had occupied in Colombia. Another decade of victims spawned by the violence, I think. The twins are in a state of high anxiety. They stand on either side of me and cling to my hands. I look down and see that my daughters have their other hands in their mouths. Tatiana chews her fingernails and Rosanna gnaws her knuckles. We tiptoe out. I led my gaggle of little Eriksons out of the nursery and into the office of the director's assistant, Yolanda. She had agreed to meet with me to discuss a child-placing agreement with our new agency. Before we began in earnest, a maid brought a tray with tiny cups of inky black coffee. Yolanda put a spoonful of sugar in her cup, sipped it and said, "We seldom place children with North Americans anymore. We prefer to work with Europeans. It takes too long to place a child in the United States," she said, as she stirred a spoonful of sugar into her cup. I couldn't let that go by, even if this beautiful woman was the epitome of Colombia's elite humanitarians. American immigration laws are in place to protect innocent children from immoral adults and criminals. And welfare recipients, I said with a grin. I knew that she, along with every educated adult in Colombia, had heard the inflammatory statements of their Pulitzer Prize-winning author Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Garcia claimed that welfare recipients in the United States imported Colombian children like bags of coffee in order to get bigger welfare payments. Yolanda stirred in another spoonful of sugar and said, "Garcia is anti-American, anti-adoption, and a card-carrying communist. He doesn't live in Colombia anymore. He lives with communist radicals in other Latin countries. He just wants to sell his shocking stories." "I couldn't agree with you more," I said. "He should know that Americans on welfare can't meet state pre-adoption requirements, pay for an adoption trip to Colombia, or qualify with the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service." She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "Garcia isn't interested in the truth. He wants to stop the flow of orphans abroad and to embarrass the United States." She put her cup down in the saucer with a loud rattle. "He's not the only one against international adoption. Others say, you have to change the infrastructure instead. You can't cure a social problem like child abandonment so easily. It's like giving a cancer patient a Band-Aid." Anger threatened to overwhelm me. I said, "Do they think that you should sit around and wait for the government to come up with a solution?" I wanted to put on a suit of armor and defend the agency like Don Quixote. Their non-profit organization had been the first of 8 founded and funded by Colombia's wealthy elite. The humanitarians took complete responsibility for the orphans while they placed them internationally, and for that they were criticized. Our children played with toys they had brought along while we talked. They knew their adoption story backwards and forwards, and they were aware that their Colombian parents would not be there to meet them. Nevertheless, I noticed that my 10-year-old daughters grew more tense by the minute. It seemed like a good time to leave. The twins didn't relax until we were back in the taxi. Then I thought I heard a tiny exhale of relief. "Thank you for showing us the babies, Mum and Dad." "You're welcome. We're going to a different agency tomorrow. We want to help them find parents for some of the little kids they take care of," I said. "Okay," they both said at once. At our meeting the next day, the director of the agency showed us a 9-year-old boy, Omar, who needed a family. We asked if we could meet him so that we would be able to tell prospective adoptive parents about him. We sat in the lounge and smiled at him, and he smiled back. "Can he ride a bike?" Tatiana wanted to know. "Can he swim?" Rosanna asked. Omar said yes to both, although he didn't get the chance to bike or swim very often. Kirk gave Omar his notebook and a pen and said that he wanted Omar to draw some pictures for him. Omar hunched over the paper and drew an exact copy of a picture Kirk had drawn. I noticed that he was a lefty. "He's smart, Mum. He just doesn't know how to talk American," 11-year-old Kirk said. On the way back to our hotel, the kids made a joint decision. "We want him, Dad. Hurry up and call the agency so that no one gets him first," Rosanna said. "His clothes are awful," Tati said. "Can't we buy him some new jeans and tennis shoes and get him a good haircut?" We picked him up the next day for a pre-placement visit. "Dad, we have to buy him new clothes," the twins insisted. We took a taxi to a department store where the girls picked out clothes and shoes. When we returned him to the orphanage the next day, he looked just like the kids in our neighborhood back home. 3 months later, he was part of our family. During our trip to Colombia, we observed protocol and met with the director of the National Family Welfare in Bogotá. She accepted our application materials and approved our agency to place orphans institutionalized throughout Colombia. The director also discussed national policies and procedures with me. I must confess that I had no basis for comparison at the time, but when I visited other countries, I realized that Colombia was far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of child welfare policies that assured good adoption practices and eliminated illegal traffic in children. In terms of child protection, Colombian officials did not rest on their laurels, but continuously improved their laws and became the benchmark for Latin America. From that point on, I was usually the first director of a private adoption agency from the United States to meet national child placing authorities in Latin America. My visits with other national child welfare officials underscored vast differences in how other governments dealt with thousands of orphaned, abandoned, and relinquished children. The majority of homeless infants and children were as doomed as an endangered species. My visits revealed a dearth of safeguards to prevent baby black markets, as well as a lack of licensed non-profit adoption agencies. Only 2 more international adoption agencies turned up in my travels, one in Ecuador and the other in Paraguay, in comparison to 8 in Colombia alone. Since my first orphan-saving expeditions in 1981, our adoption agency has placed more than 2,000 children in American homes. As their spiritual grandfather, the sight of all these happy, well-adjusted children brings me great joy. They make me forget the difficulties and setbacks that Los Niños experienced in the early days. The immigrant children are worth every minute of effort I put into building the agency's international adoption programs. After my visit to Colombia, I traveled to Chile to meet with the national welfare authorities in Santiago. In 1973, General Pinochet had violently overthrown the elected Allende's Marxist government. Unemployment and poverty were widespread. So were human rights violations. Overzealous Marxists tried to recapture control and to overthrow Pinochet until 1990. The interpretation of Chile's international adoption procedures was left up to lawyers in private practice and judges. Since licensed, non-profit adoption agencies did not exist, I founded one in Santiago to care for infants and children during the legal process. Other reputable agencies soon traveled to Chile, made their own contacts within the legal system, and referred children to American couples for adoption. But when word got around that half of the children were Caucasian, a rush for Chilean babies was on. Unfortunately, the welfare authorities did not supervise adoptions. Criminal types paid a pittance to mothers in the slums to relinquish their children. The criminals profited when they placed the child internationally. When the Chilean welfare authorities got wind of this black market activity, they placed a moratorium on international adoptions. From then on, only Chileans could adopt children under 4 years old. Adverse reactions to international adoption rumbled like a volcano before it erupts. Horror stories about adoption made the rounds on radio, television, and print media. At the time, close to 5,000 orphans from various countries were legally adopted and immigrated by US citizens each year. However, their heartwarming reports never got attention like the horror stories. To keep on top of things, we joined the Joint Council for International Children's Services, the first affiliation of licensed, not-for-profit child welfare agencies that serve children through inter-country adoption and relief efforts. The membership is well aware that the future of relinquished, abandoned, and orphaned children throughout the world is at stake. JCICS members raise the quality of life in many orphanages around the world. Humanitarian efforts in orphanages abroad are just as important as adoption. As I managed Los Niños International Adoption Center, I kept up my studies in Spanish, a language I first studied in Germany. It became my third language, although I never gained the mastery I have in English. But I was able to get around on my own as I visited each country to meet national child placing authorities. Tegucigalpa, Honduras, was next on my list for a visit with child-placing authorities at the National Social Welfare Department. At that time, they did not supervise adoptions. The only way to adopt was through private lawyers. The country had suffered under Hurricane Hattie a few years before, and the border regions were full of refugees from the civil war between the Sandinistas and the Contras in the neighboring country of Nicaragua. A lot of children were orphaned, abandoned, and homeless. Even though adoptive parents had to stay in Honduras for over a month while the adoption slowly proceeded through the courts, they were happy to have a child, and they made the best of it. Our families adopted. Nearly 200 Honduran children until a baby parts rumor was born at a consular ball. An anti-American Honduran official claimed, "Americans buy babies here just to harvest their organs." He timed his provocative statement perfectly. The rumor rippled through embassies, child welfare departments, the Honduran public, and splashed across the globe. Certain media ate it up. They concocted stories and crafted titles guaranteed to startle and draw in watchers, listeners, and readers. Eventually, the claim was investigated at its source in Honduras and in neighboring Guatemala, and found to be false by an independent French team of human rights investigators. But the damage was done. To this day, the rumor pops up in such remote areas as Siberia and causes judges to delay or deny adoptions. In Honduras, during the rumor's heyday, their government was forced to place a moratorium on adoption and to reorganize the process. A year later, ours was the first agency to be licensed under their new system, but few children have been assigned to adoptive parents since then. The potential for civil war in Central America seemed limitless. El Salvador's civil war was fought between the guerrillas, supported by Cuba and the Sandinistas, and the right-wing military with death squads. The assassination of Archbishop Romero in his church set off a widespread rebellion in San Salvador. A Salvadorian friend, Rosa Martinez, kept us apprised of events. Although the needs were great for the orphans, travel was dangerous. John held back the tears when I left for San Salvador. "Don't worry, Rosa's relatives will make sure that I stay out of trouble," I said. She frowned at my flip reply. "I know you're not afraid, but think about us," she said with a flash of anger. My war experiences had made me fearless. I thought that my battles in Africa were far behind me, shunted off in the recesses of my mind. Yet the minute I laid eyes on the beleaguered city of San Salvador, heard gunfire and spotted vultures in the sky, old battle scenes flashed back in my eyes. On top of it, San Salvador was under siege and carried on with business as usual, just as Kiel had. I met with the head of the National Child Placing Authority, the National First Court of Minors, and presented him with our agency's credentials and a child placing agreement that he reviewed and signed at a meeting at the end of the week. A week in San Salvador was like a week in the Afrika Korps. I lay awake and listened for the next fusillade, the final merciless attack. Retreat was out of the question. I needed to call Jean to tell her what I was going through, and how much I would rather be home with her. My Salvadorian friends tried to talk me out of it. "You stick out like a sore thumb. They might kidnap you and hold you for ransom or shoot you just for the fun of it." When they realized that I was going to make the call with them or without them, they gave me the correct coins and made a human shield around me on my way to the telephone booth. Nice try. I stood a head taller than they did. "Put your white face down," they hissed. When I got back home, I felt like I had just survived an Allied attack. My nerves were shot. Word of my escapade got around, and soon a brave and cocky Salvadorian, Juan, volunteered to bring the orphans out after the adoptions were finalized in court. When I told him that I was worried about what might happen to him, he answered, "You're a gringo. No one will even notice me." He soon discovered that he had two enemies to worry about. He could avoid the warring parties, but he couldn't stay away from the Court of Minors. Unscrupulous individuals in the government wanted their cut. Eventually, they found a way to delay the proxy adoption of a sibling pair and kept Juan waiting for the final decree in order to get a bribe out of him. Juan respected our agency for its policy of no bribery, and he showed up at the orphanage with empty pockets. He hung around and let them know that he was prepared to wait forever, if necessary. The orphanage director ended the standoff. She took his side and pressured the court to issue the adoption decree. "We've placed nearly 20 orphans, Juan, but we can't work in El Salvador anymore," I told him. "I'm sorry, I never thought my people would act like this," he said. "My idealism is totaled, wrecked." After that experience, I took stock of the situation. We needed a peaceful country that would allow the agency to establish a presence and promote self-help projects as well as adoption. Guatemala was the first country where I was able to create this, with Foundation Los Niños de Guatemala. The country was in bad shape from volcanic chain reactions across the country. Other trouble brewed in the highlands due to the government's repression of the Mayan Indian population. However, our new foster homes in Guatemala City were safe havens. That summer, we brought our own children to Guatemala for a visit. By then, they were in high school. When we visited the Mayan city of Chichicastenango, Mayan girls ran up to Kirk to stroke his white arms and to try to reach his golden hair. He had grown to 6 feet, 7 inches by then, and got a huge kick out of their antics. Omar liked the bazaars, where he could hear the Mayans bargain in 4 languages and make change in 4 currencies. "Boy, these people are smart," he said, as he watched a Mayan boy whip out a pocket calculator and figure out a price for a Japanese tourist. The culture was so fascinating that we lingered on the church steps with Mayans who prayed under aromatic clouds of incense.